When I bought the cabin 3 years ago, I knew I wanted to get away from the city noise, not walk into a new layer of bureaucratic nonsense. Nestled deep in the pine forest and set beside a glassy lake, it was my escape from the chaos of daily life. What I didn't realize was that the cabin, though secluded, technically fell within the jurisdiction of an overzealous HOA committee that had recently expanded its reach. That's where Karen came in, HOA president, self-proclaimed enforcer, and local busybody. She had a flair for drama and control, constantly issuing notices for unauthorized structures and violations of appearance standards, which basically meant if your lawn wasn't mowed to military precision, she was on your case. At first, my wife Tara and I ignored her. We weren't technically part of the HOA when we purchased the land, it was grandfathered out. But Karen had a habit of ignoring legal boundaries when they didn't suit her agenda. Over the months, she sent us half a dozen letters claiming we were obligated to submit to surprise inspections, despite no such clause in any contract. It all came to a head one crisp fall afternoon, when she marched onto our property with a clipboard and a smug smile. Tara was on the porch repainting the trim when Karen stomped up the steps like she owned the place. "We're here for the mandatory cabin check," Karen snapped, her voice brittle with authority. Behind her stood two equally sour-faced HOA board members, one with a smartphone already recording. Tara didn't flinch. She calmly placed her paintbrush down, wiped her hands on her jeans, and stepped forward. "You're not welcome here without a warrant or legal order," she said, arms crossed. Karen scoffed, waving a stack of papers. "This gives me all the authority I need," she barked. But Tara was ready. I had gone over every zoning law and property code when we first received Karen's letters, and Tara had memorized the key statutes. "That's not a warrant, Karen. That's an HOA memo," Tara replied coolly, pulling her phone out and recording as well. Karen's face turned red as her voice rose, but Tara didn't back down. "Step off our porch, or I'll call the sheriff for trespassing." Karen's smirk faded just a bit. "Go ahead," she hissed. "I already called them to enforce the inspection. Let's see what they think." 20 minutes later, a county sheriff's cruiser rolled up the gravel road, tires crunching the pine needles. Karen turned with an expression of victorious satisfaction as the deputy stepped out. That satisfaction lasted about 3 seconds. The deputy, a tall, clean-shaven man in his late 30s, gave Karen a sharp glance before walking straight to Tara and shaking her hand. "Ma'am," he said with a respectful nod. "We had a call about a disturbance, but based on the address, I figured it might be HOA business again." Karen's face morphed into confusion, then rage. "Officer, I called you to enforce the inspection. These people are violating community policy," she barked. The deputy didn't even look at her. "Karen, we've been over this. This property isn't under your HOA jurisdiction. You've been warned not to trespass here before." Karen began to stammer, pulling the same papers she had shown Tara earlier. "I have documentation," she insisted. That's when the second sheriff's cruiser pulled in, this one driven by none other than Sheriff Daniels himself. He stepped out slowly, adjusted his hat, and looked directly at Karen with cold familiarity. Sheriff Daniels approached, giving my wife a nod and even a friendly smile. Then he turned his full attention on Karen. "Didn't I tell you the last time? You come back here again and you'll be facing charges." Karen blustered. But this is a community matter. It's my duty to uphold standards," she whined, clearly trying to rally the board members behind her. They both looked like they wanted to vanish into the woods. Daniels reached out and took the paper Karen was waving. He glanced over it, then shook his head. "Karen, this is the same garbage memo you printed last time. You don't have authority here." Then, almost casually, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "You know what I do have. A warrant for your arrest." The color drained from Karen's face as the paper unfolded in front of her. What? This must be a joke," she gasped. But it wasn't. Daniels handed the warrant to Tara, who glanced over it and raised an eyebrow. It was for multiple counts of harassment, trespassing, and false impersonation of a public official, charges she had racked up across several properties in the area. Tara calmly held it up, and Karen stepped back like it had physically struck her. The scene froze in stunned silence. Even the birds in the pines seemed to hush. Then Karen shrieked, "This isn't real. I'm the victim here." But no one was buying it, not the officers, not the HOA board members, and definitely not Tara. Sheriff Daniels stepped forward and began reading her rights as he placed her in cuffs. "You have the right to remain silent," Karen writhed and screamed, demanding to speak to her lawyer, the mayor, anyone who would validate her imagined power. But no one came. As she was walked toward the patrol car, she twisted around and yelled, "You'll regret this. I'll sue you all." Tara just smiled and waved. "Make sure to file that from county jail." Once the cruisers were gone, silence returned. Tara and I sat on the porch swing, watching the sun set over the trees, finally free of Karen's constant surveillance and threats. "Think she'll try again?" I asked. Tara shrugged. "Not from where she's going." But deep down, we both knew this wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type to give up easily, and the WA still had more snakes waiting to slither out. But for now, we enjoyed the peace she could no longer disturb. Karen's arrest should have been the end of the nightmare, but Tara and I quickly discovered that when you cut off the head of the WA Hydra, more grow back in its place. Within a week of Karen being booked, her deputy, the vice president of the WA, a passive-aggressive weasel named Stuart, started sending out thinly veiled threats. We got a letter that read, "The association will not tolerate unlawful resistance to routine checks." Routine checks. Stuart acted like this was a gated subdivision in the suburbs and not a privately owned off-grid cabin in the woods. Tara, ever prepared, fired off a cease and desist notice via our lawyer, but Stuart wasn't fazed. One evening, while I was hauling firewood in from the back shed, I noticed something strange. A small, blinking red light nestled in the branches of a pine tree facing our porch. Tara climbed up the ladder and pulled out a micro camera. It was live recording. We found 2 more hidden near the driveway. These people weren't just power tripping, they were escalating. So, we filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's office, and this time, it wasn't just Karen's name that popped up. Apparently, Stuart and a few others had continued a campaign of covert surveillance across the county under the guise of neighborhood enforcement. What they didn't know was that we were already working with an attorney who specialized in WA abuse. Enter Marlene Thorne, our new legal powerhouse. She was sharp, quick-witted, and had an absolute zero-tolerance policy for WA overreach. After reviewing our case, she pulled out a thick file of similar complaints across the region. "This isn't isolated," she told us over coffee at the cabin. Karen was the face, but there's a deeper rot here. Stuart and the treasurer, Linda, your typical clipboard crusaders, have been building a paper empire of intimidation. Marlene began gathering witness testimonies, and we discovered something shocking. Over a dozen families had quietly sold their properties and moved away after relentless targeting from the WA. Some were fined for things like using eco-friendly paint not approved by the board or trimming trees without arboreal clearance. Marlene filed for a restraining order against the WA, and soon after, we received word that a county civil investigator would be opening a case. In the meantime, Stuart showed up again, this time smug and flanked by a supposed compliance officer. They claimed they were rechecking zoning violations. Tara didn't even blink. She pulled out her phone and streamed them live on social media. Within minutes, the comments exploded, viewers from all over siding with us and ridiculing the WA. Stuart turned beet red and hissed, "You'll regret this." Tara smiled. "You're already regretting it, aren't you?" It was around this time that Karen resurfaced. After posting bail, she hadn't come directly to our cabin, but she'd been spotted attending WA meetings via Zoom, spitting venom about people who think they're above community law. A neighbor tipped us off that Karen was planning something. She'd been calling in favors from local realtors and spreading false claims about our cabin being up for foreclosure due to code violations. It was outright slander. Marlene immediately hit back with a lawsuit for defamation. But the deeper issue emerged when we received a notice from the county records office. Someone had attempted to file an easement request that would give the WA access to part of our driveway, labeling it as a shared utility path. It was fake, completely forged. Tara and I were furious. We marched into the records office and demanded an investigation. The clerk, once she saw the signature mismatch, escalated it to the county's legal team. Turns out, the WA had filed several fraudulent easement claims across multiple cabins in the area, hoping no one would notice until they could claim common access rights. This wasn't just Karen or Stuart, it was a full-blown conspiracy. The county's legal response was swift. A full audit was launched on the HOA's financials and operational decisions from the last 5 years. We were granted a temporary injunction protecting our property from any and all WA interference. At the same time, Stuart vanished, no more visits, no letters. Turns out, he'd fled the state after realizing he could be charged for forgery. Linda, the treasurer, lawyered up and claimed ignorance. Karen, on the other hand, doubled down. She posted daily rants online calling us liars, deep state plants, and even anti-community radicals. None of it stuck, but it added pressure. So, Tara and I flipped the script. We invited all our neighbors, even ones we hadn't spoken to much, over for a weekend bonfire. There, we shared everything: documents, evidence, timelines. What followed was unexpected. Neighbors stood up, one after another, to share their own horror stories. One couple revealed they were forced to demolish a chicken coop because it didn't match HOA color standards. Another man said Karen had personally reported him for excessive hammock use on weekends. We realized something bigger: this wasn't just a war against us. It was a rebellion waiting to happen. Fueled by community outrage and armed with Marlene's relentless legal strategy, we rallied everyone to file a class action lawsuit against the HOA board. The hearing was scheduled 3 weeks out, and by the time we walked into that courtroom, we weren't just two people fighting for our land, we were 30 families seeking justice. Karen arrived wearing a stiff blazer, smug as ever, but the smile melted when the judge read the first charges aloud: fraud, illegal surveillance, harassment, and abuse of power. Tara testified first, calm and measured, while I backed it up with our footage, documents, and timelines. Then came the neighbors, story after story confirming a pattern of psychological and financial warfare. The final blow came when the county auditor presented proof of misused funds. Karen and Stuart had rerouted thousands of HOA dollars into consulting payments made to themselves. The courtroom was dead silent. The judge didn't hold back. Not only was the HOA disbanded pending full investigation, but criminal proceedings were ordered against Karen and her inner circle. As we left the courthouse that day, Tara squeezed my hand and said, "That's one snake pit burned to the ground." But I could see the glint in her eyes. She wasn't just satisfied. She was ready for whatever came next. The courtroom victory was only the beginning of something far bigger than either Tara or I had anticipated. With the HOA formally disbanded, a vacuum of control formed across the community, one that didn't stay empty for long. While Karen was under house arrest awaiting trial, and Stuart was still missing in action, a few opportunistic former board members started trying to rally residents into forming a new and improved neighborhood committee. They called it the Community Revival Council. It sounded innocent, idealistic, even. But we weren't fooled. It was the same power-hungry personalities with a fresh coat of paint. Tara and I were approached by one of them, Lydia, the former HOA secretary, who smiled sweetly and suggested we rebuild trust and community values. My wife's response was as surgical as ever. "You mean like when Karen tried to forge easements and install illegal cameras on private land?" Lydia's smile cracked. She retreated, but not before letting slip that Karen still had supporters. Loyal ones. The kind who believed everything she posted online, no matter how ridiculous it sounded. Tara and I realized something important that day. The legal war was over, but the psychological one had just begun. In the following weeks, weird things started happening around the cabin. First, our satellite internet began cutting out, always around 8 p.m., right when Tara would upload updates for the local community page. We thought it was coincidence until our provider confirmed someone had tampered with the satellite dish. Then, strange, for sale, signs began appearing at the end of our road, nailed to trees and facing the highway, each one listing our address. We tore them down, but new ones would appear overnight. One morning, Tara stepped outside to find a box on our porch. Inside was a dead squirrel, wrapped in a note that read, "Get out while you can." We immediately filed a police report, but the deputy admitted that without video evidence or a suspect, it would be hard to track. That was when we decided to install motion sensor floodlights and surveillance cams of our own. We caught glimpses, figures darting through trees at night, hooded silhouettes crouching near our woodpile, and once, someone scratching the words, "Traitor," into the side of our shed. Tara reviewed the footage frame by frame and spotted a familiar gait, even in shadow, Lydia. But she was smart enough to never show her face. With the sheriff's department already strained and Karen's supporters emboldened, we decided to take matters into our own hands. Tara started organizing weekend, cabin watch, gatherings. Residents from nearby properties would rotate nights staying over at each other's homes, offering solidarity, security, and community meals by the fire. It worked. We started reclaiming the peace we had once come here for. Kids ran around safely during the day, and the bonfires lit up our weekends with laughter and stories. But even with the unity, the tension was thick beneath the surface. Then came the day we discovered something explosive. One of our new friends, Ron, a retired property attorney, had been combing through old HOA meeting minutes for evidence to help a neighbor with a zoning dispute. He stumbled on a file marked, Project Timberline. Buried deep inside were documents revealing a secret plan the old HOA had pushed for years, rezoning the entire lakeside cabin area into a controlled residential retreat, meaning mass buyouts, forced easements, and commercial development. Karen, Stuart, and Lydia had all signed off. But what stunned us most, our cabin had been marked as Central Lodge property. They had planned to turn it into a rental resort hub, and we were never supposed to know. That discovery lit a fire under us like nothing before. We made digital copies and immediately submitted them to the county commissioner and a local journalist Tara trusted. The story went viral overnight. Secret HOA plan to commercialize private lakefront property exposed. Karen's supporters began to backtrack, embarrassed and humiliated. Lydia went silent. The county issued a cease work order on all future development permits tied to the now-defunct HOA. But the real win came when several former members were subpoenaed for conspiracy and attempted fraud. We felt relief. Finally, things were settling down. That weekend, we hosted the biggest bonfire yet. Over 40 people showed up. There was music, food, and genuine joy in the air. I looked at Tara as she laughed beside the flames, and for the first time in months, I felt like we were safe. But peace is a tricky thing. Just as the crowd began to thin out and families were heading back to their cabins, a loud bang echoed through the woods, followed by the unmistakable sound of shattered glass. Someone had thrown a rock through our front window. When I ran inside, taped to the rock was a photo, an old one of Tara, taken from behind while she was at the lake. Scribbled across it, "You think this is over?" The next morning, we had a long talk with Sheriff Daniels, who had grown more personally invested in the situation. "This is no longer HOA nonsense," he said grimly. "This is organized harassment." He offered to install a mobile patrol checkpoint along the main road for at least a month, and we accepted. Tara, meanwhile, took the threat personally and seriously. She doubled down on digital surveillance, began drone mapping the woods at night, and even convinced Ron to help draft a petition to designate our area as a private sanctuary zone under local conservation law. If passed, it would not only shield us from any future development but permanently block land transfers that violated privacy zoning. The petition gained rapid support, especially after news of the rock attack spread. People were angry that the peace of their forest retreat was under siege by the lingering poison of one woman's obsession. As for Karen, her trial date was approaching fast, and public opinion had firmly turned against her. Still, we couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't done. If she couldn't control us legally, she'd try something else. And deep in my gut, I knew we hadn't seen the last of her.